So this is Unit 5. We'll be looking at Part 3 and 4 in this video, male and female animals. Male animals are a little simpler, female animals a little more complex. And so as we look at the differences, that will become apparent. A few things to talk about with males first, or I guess animals in general, is this concept of pheromones. We've talked about pheromones before. Pheromones play an important role in animal reproduction. These are chemical sensors that can be sent in the air, and oftentimes with animal reproduction it is the female that is producing these pheromones and the male that is receiving them, but it is still an example of chemical communication. The males can sense those pheromones that the female is perhaps ready to reproduce, and then they can act accordingly. And so a couple of things in animal reproduction before we get to male-female so much. One of those terms is hermaphrodites. Hermaphrodite is an organism that possesses both male and female sexual organs. They cannot self-fertilize, which is one misconception. But earthworms, for instance, possess both male and female sex organs, and so they are able to find any other earthworm to reproduce, and this is an advantage. Finding a mate is oftentimes what animals spend a lot of their resources on, and so this reduces that necessity. In other organisms, there is something called sequential hermaphrodites. Sequential hermaphrodites. And sequential hermaphrodites become the other sex at some point in their life. This example here of fish is protogynous. Proto means first, or alpha. GYN means female. And so essentially what is going on here, this is where the alpha female becomes male. When the male in the group dies, the alpha female will become male, and thus moving the female line up the ladder. And so what does this ensure? Well, that the best genes are always going forward. There's no competition between the males in the group because there's only one of them, and the alpha female becomes male. You can have the same kind of idea in the opposite direction. It's called proto-androus, and this is where the alpha male becomes female. Again, this guarantees that the most fit genes are passed on to the next generation. A couple other things that we need to talk about with animal reproduction is the concept of external and internal fertilization. Fertilization, again, is the fusing of two haploid cells together to form a diploid zygote. In some animals, this happens externally. You can see these frogs here. The male frog is actually squeezing the eggs out of the female frog, and then he will fertilize them. This happens with a lot of lower animals where they just kind of put their sperm and egg into the water and hope they combine. But not necessarily, this is not necessarily primitive versus non-primitive. Frogs are rather advanced in the animal kingdom, and so this isn't necessarily the divide. And then there's internal fertilization. Same idea, except fertilization happens inside the organism rather than outside. And so in this case, it doesn't necessitate that development occur inside the organism, like, say with humans, like you see in the picture. It could be that it develops in an egg, and that egg is put in a nest and like a bird or a reptile. And so there are some distinctions there as well. And so for males specifically, let's look at the concept of spermatogenesis. Spermatogenesis is the idea of creating sperm, and sperm originate with a diploid cell called spermatogonium, which is located in the testes of the male. The spermatogonium undergoes mitotic divisions, like it says here. Those mitotic divisions create other diploid cells, and this is kind of like the origination of sperm cells. But those spermatogonium can also undergo the process of meiosis. And without, again, going into detail of meiosis and all the ins and outs here, the main idea is that this process of meiosis creates 4 haploid cells. And in sperm production, those cells, those haploid cells, again, are all unique from one another, and they're all viable. Well, at least they should be, theoretically. They're all viable. And we're going to see a difference in that in the female reproductive system, whereas the egg cells are not necessarily all going to be used. So a little bit about sperm anatomy before we move on. The anatomy of the sperm cell is very utilitarian. You have the head, which contains the nucleus, the DNA, the haploid copy that is coming to fertilize the egg. Also in the head is the acrosome. The acrosome will be essential in breaking down the barrier between it and the egg in order so it can make a connection with the egg cell. We'll talk about that in the next video. The midpiece is full of mitochondria. Basically serves as an engine to move the tail. This tail is composed of cytoskeletal elements, remember microtubules, which were used in the spindle fibers and other pieces inside the cytoskeleton. Those tail pieces will actually become a very important part of the division of the new zygote as it grows. This idea of producing sperm in males is called a primary sexual characteristic. All right, and the idea of producing sperm, primary sexual characteristic, just like in females, the primary sexual characteristic is production of egg. But also in males, there are secondary sexual characteristics. And these secondary characteristics vary in species. Here you see a man with a prodigious beard, and that beard is something that males of the species can do that females can't necessarily do. And you see this in other species. You see lions, for instance. The male lion is bigger and has a mane. The male peacock has these big bright feathers. The male cardinal has bright red. The female cardinal is kind of this grayish color. And so you see this difference between sexes oftentimes, and this happens through the idea of secondary sexual characteristics. Now, all of these sexual characteristics are initiated by a hormone. We'll talk about this again with females. That's called GnRH. And GnRH, again, it's released by the hypothalamus at puberty, and that GnRH tells the reproductive system to kind of turn on, and those primary characteristics start up in males, the production of sperm, and females, the production of eggs, and the secondary characteristics also begin. And with people, we call this puberty. And these male hormones that are then released by the second in command, which is the pituitary, are called the androgens. Now, we are going to just group them all together in males and call them androgens, but in females, they're going to have some more specific names, which brings me to that topic of females. In female organisms, these ideas are a little bit more complex, and so moving on, talk about the female anatomy, the important portions of that. The uterus is the place where the developing organism will be. Not all animals have this, but they do have something like this where the eggs are stored and then laid later. But in mammals and others, there's this placenta, or mammals that have a placenta, or not all mammals do, where the organism is developed in the womb. And so there's some differences there, but for the main idea, uterus, developing organism, and the endometrium then is the lining of the uterus. The ovary is where eggs are produced, and the ovary releases the egg and puts it into this oviduct or fallopian tube, and the egg travels through the uterus. It's oftentimes the egg is fertilized actually in the oviduct. The egg is contained in a structure called the follicle. And the follicle will mature over time and releases the egg, and the leftover pieces of the follicle are called the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is kind of like the empty eggshell, and it will degrade over time as well. And so getting on then to the primary characteristics, this is oogenesis, where we had spermatogenesis in the last one, and you have the oogonium instead of the spermatogonium. The big difference here is going to be that rather than have 4 cells at the end, you're only going to have one egg cell. The other cells are still created. Those divisions occur. They're called polar bodies, and they're not needed. The egg is going to contain all the cytoplasm, basically going to keep all the cytoplasm. You still have a haploid cell, but this egg is going to be very big compared to its companions. And the idea here is, we'll talk more about this in the next video, but the egg contains all the cytoplasm because those first few divisions aren't going to grow. They're going to just divide without growing, and so all that cytoplasm is necessary for those new cells. And so with that, in males, one thing I didn't mention, in males this process is not cyclic. It does not produce, it does not happen on a cycle. It just happens at regular, or it begins and then it doesn't really end until the male's death. In females, this happens on a cycle. With other animals, this cycle is called estrus. Estrus is what we oftentimes call heat with like dogs and cats, or rut with white-tailed deer. Um, happens once or twice a year, and the animal body basically reabsorbs the uterine lining, the endometrium. In humans, this process is called menses, or the menstrual cycle, whereas the endometrium is produced and then shed once every 28 days. And so, to quickly go over that cycle, this picture kind of shows the different days associated with that. And so I'm going to use this picture to outline this process. So there's two processes that are going on at the same time. There's the ovarian cycle, this is where I want to focus our attention, and the menstrual cycle. So first we'll talk about the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is going to be divided into 5 different sections, as you can see here. First is days 0 through 5, and this is oftentimes called the flow phase, or the menstrual flow phase. During the flow phase, the old endometrium is released, and basically pregnancy did not occur, so that old endometrium then is released out of the body, and basically preparing the body for a new pregnancy. That's days 1 through 5. Days 5 through 13 are called the proliferative phase. As you can see here on this picture, the proliferative phase, estrogen, which is released in another part of the body, we'll talk about in a moment, causes the new endometrium to be built back up. As you can see on this graph, that new endometrium is being built back up, and it basically serves as a cushion for the developing fetus, if that is to happen. Day 14 is called ovulation. And ovulation is just simply the release of the egg. So on day 14 you have ovulation, the release of the egg. Day 14 through 25 is called the secretory phase. This is where progesterone, which is again released in another part of the body, causes this new endometrium to release and secrete, which is where you get the secretory phase, a sugary substance. The sugar will serve to feed the developing fetus as the umbilical cord develops and as the placenta develops. And so this is an early stage development. And then days 25 through 28 are called the endometrial breakdown phase. As you can see here, this is starting to go down again. It's going to lead back over to here. This whole cycle, the endometrium is being broken down because fertilization did not occur. There is no implanted organism, and so that structure is being broken down. While that is going on, you also have a cycle called the ovarian cycle. It tells you where it's happening. It's happening in the ovary. And so what's going on then is, in the ovarian cycle, before this occurs, there's a hormone that is called GnRH, appearing in this picture. GnRH is released by the hypothalamus, and the GnRH basically tells the pituitary to release a hormone, and that hormone is called follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, in this picture. And that follicle stimulating hormone causes the follicle to begin maturing. So this follicle that's in the ovary is going to begin maturing, and it is going to continue to do so in the first 13 days. This is called the follicular phase. So during the follicular phase, you have the maturation of the egg. That egg begins releasing estrogen to tell the endometrium to begin building up. Then that egg is released. There's a hormone also released by the pituitary called luteinizing hormone, which causes the egg to be released. Once the egg is released, it leaves behind a structure called the corpus luteum. And so days 15 through 28 are called the luteal phase. That corpus luteum is going to begin to degenerate. While it is degenerating, it is releasing a hormone called progesterone, which is causing the endometrium to build that, or to create that sugary substance, which will allow the incoming fetus to be nurtured. Well, when the corpus luteum is gone, when it degenerates to nothing, it is no longer releasing progesterone. The hypothalamus realizes that there's no longer any progesterone in the body, and once it realizes that, it releases GnRH again to begin the cycle over. And so there is a time in the woman's life called menopause, which the hypothalamus is no longer then releasing GnRH. Therefore, those cycles are discontinued. So whereas the male is non-cyclic and continuous, the female is cyclic and has a definite beginning and end.